Dark Harvest is the new book written by Will Jordan, better known online as his YouTube persona, The Critical Drinker. Now, this is my rough, try not to spoil too much, but still get a gist of the story across why, given some feedback, I help him, his fans, and maybe even his critics can get something out of. You can let me know how well I do in the comments section or with one of those fun thumb buttons down below. Funny enough, Dark Harvest's opening prologue reminds me a lot of Leviathan Wakes, the first novel in James S. A. Corey's Expanse book series. The setup is much different, but they both focus on a young woman in a dire situation. Instead of being trapped in a closet on a spaceship, the girl is treading through a mountain pass in the middle of a blizzard. At the end of the young girl's passage, it continues on with a point of view switch to another group. Given what we've seen before, it is very predictable what is going to happen to this other group after a certain point. All the tall tale signs are there, but given this is over 60 years ago, it's not like any of the characters would pick up on all the hints that most of us media-saturated readers will immediately pick up on. More is revealed about the plot in Dark Harvest compared to the Expanse's first book's prologue. Now getting into the first chapter. If I was to be critical about the beginning, I would have to say it comes off as sort of contrived. Jordan wastes very little time, with some basic character development and world building worked in rather naturally before throwing the audience into the action. It is a bit hard to follow the action after the main character of the story, Becker, who is a private military contractor, when Becker's vehicle is T-boned. But that could be on purpose to represent the disorientation of Becker and an interesting writing choice that I can approve of. Aside from some issues, this setup was done rather well. Now, the reason I said in the beginning it could come off as a little contrived. At a certain section, there's some dialogue given to the bad guy right before Becker is saved from certain death that sets him down the path that he will be blazing a trail through, and this leads Becker down a certain path that I find completely logical, but a little cliche in a couple of ways. There are actually many moments in the book very similar to this, which I take issue with mildly, but if I wasn't looking too deeply to do a critique style review of this book, I might have not even noticed. There's some very tension-filled moments that will have the audience questioning what will happen to the characters, with some things set up earlier in the novel sort of justifying how they're saved. Now, some of these setups might be forgotten by the audience and it might come off worse than it could in reality when you're looking at it with a critical eye, but it will make a difference in the scene and in this critique. So that incredibly contrived scene leads to a series of rash decisions that cause a tragic event that just adds to Becker's desire to dive deeper into the mystery at seemingly all costs. Despite this mild criticism, it is an excellent example of how to get a smart character to act stupidly for the sake of the story. The story doesn't go crazy with the zombie-like virus hinted at in the prologue until the end of chapter 12, and that doesn't ramp up till overdrive until chapter 13. Given that it introduces a new protagonist, Lori Dalton, a chapter before, a smart, bold, morally driven female doctor doctor of the World Health Organization. But I did phrase that incorrectly on purpose for a purpose. Now, I don't realistically think this is a dig at the infamous 13th Doctor played by Jodie Whittaker, because it really doesn't seem to be a series Jordan covers a lot under his Critical Drinker character. Now, could this be just my personal bias mixed with my knowledge of the writer that gives me this impression? Probably. But if I had to do a serious reading of this, then I would guess this chapter is referring to the doomsday clock or something similar. When the doomsday clock hits 12, it means an event will destroy the world, has occurred, or something like that. But it might just be total bullshit that I'm reading into it. Now, could either of these impressions be correct? Maybe. I could just be doing too much thinking, trying to give meaning just to these chapter numbers. But I thought I would put it out there. I'm trying to give this critical drinker book a really deep reading. And since critical drinker commonly talks about the message in his videos, it would not be odd to see he has one in his latest novel. Even if it's rather subtle, he definitely does do readings into it, so him putting in his writing, even if it's just a petty reference, which I saw a few points that I'll expand on later. I can sense there might be a few, but since that would just be speculation, just like with this idea, I'll save it for the end of this, review, critique, analysis, whatever you want to call it. Back to what can be found in the book, you have a badass male protagonist meeting up with a smart-ass female protagonist in this section. And this almost mirrors the antagonist's male-female pairing in this book in sort of a perverse way. Not gonna spoil it too much, but hard to tell for sure on that front, given the female of the antag side is sort of shrouded in the most mystery out of the foursome. But it is clear that she, the female antagonist, is like, fuck this world. Why the female protagonist is more like, fuck this world. See the difference? So Becker and Dalton get together, and not in a sexual way, although that tension might be there. You can sense it. But in a shit, I don't want to die, so I'll trust this stranger for now. They bug out, and before anything can be done, Becker's foil from before pops up because he's just a titsy bit pissed at Becker for certain reasons. So for mystery reasons, which can be found if you read the book, they all go off together. Tension is high, they go along, they get in sort of a tight spot. Now this leads to them all getting along, not really getting along, but at least they form an uneasy alliance. So during dire straits, they get together, they go after another potential lead in this story, and it doesn't go too well for them. But I will say, third time's a charm. Sorry if my vagueness is getting too abstract, but I'm trying to do a quick run through without giving too much away. And there's certain points I do want to touch upon in this story. Certain elements in this section can come across as a little too convenient, especially that third time charm bit. Becker and the antagonist have a connection that seems to be the cause of the plot convenience here. It makes sense in the story and gives some emotional weight and logic behind it. But it still puts out it's a small world vibe to the story after all. And this relationship between the two, Becker and the antagonist, seems to be similar to Jubei's connection to the big bad in 1993's Ninja Scroll movie. And despite a series of some smart decisions for the heroes for once, the ball for the end of the world gets set in motion. So what do you do when you're down on the scoreboard and have no hope of winning in American football? You try for a Hail Mary play, and that's exactly what's done. Why this gamble pays off for the good team, it only gets them halfway to the touchdown zone in this metaphor, and they're up against a tough defense with very little time left on the board. And here I want to criticize this story. But it is set up so well, it's rather hard to do so. There seems to be several scenes that seem to be in the story just for building suspense and emotional impact. Not to mention the big twist and turn at the finish line. Now, I at least understand the decisions that were made that in a hypercritical way would definitely be worthy of criticism. For example, there's this one scene, the threat of death is present, but that could have been easily avoided. Well, not easily. They sort of dodged past it because the matter that they were attending to was supposedly time critical or something like that. They could have backed off, but they didn't back off from doing the thing that they were doing, and that was a little off in my opinion. This leads to a very tense moment that seems rather illogical at the time. But okay, I'll give them that. They felt that they couldn't back off from this, even though they could have easily, and same result with less tension. So, given that they had to hurry up and get the job done, you figured they just wouldn't stand around and talk unless it came down to making hard decisions. And that is done for the most part, except for one time where I was like, oh, this is a nice conversation that really gives some depth and weight to the scene. But should they be standing around chatting when they were in such a rush before that they could have risked dying? It just seems a little off, these two scenes, not back to back, but close enough in the same sort of tempo and flow that you wouldn't think that you would slow down and do it, but I understand why it was done, and I will talk about it later. Now, it's clear from the next scene why this was done, because right after that rather almost bullshit twist comes into play. Hence, they couldn't have brought it up naturally as they could have and worked it in the story despite the logical inconsistency it created in the story. Even though it was a twist, going back through the book, it sort of doesn't come out of nowhere. There are hints, I guess, you can see. Not gonna say that the story gives any great good hints to this twist, but just like Becker's past connection to the primary antagonist for most of the book, I guess our female protagonist needs some contrived reason to have her moment to shine. Personally, I want to blame Utopia, but given the writer's probably more into Marvel, it's probably related to some sort of Thanos thing in some way, but that's just my impression of it. Despite how out of the blue this twist is, it is handled rather well and, somewhat believable for the most part. Even the strokes of luck that just keep on popping up is explained in a certain way. I might not be the happiest with the way Jordan handles it, but I like to keep my sci-fi and fantasy elements separated. And there is a slight supernatural force supposedly guiding Becker to the few lucky breaks he gets to the end of the story. This is reflected in the writing and raises some questions that I might have in a media analysis of the story. But I wish to reflect on the writing before I bring up those points. As for the writing, the character writing is strong for the most part. Now, some of the dialogue and the thought processes that is revealed to the audience can come off as, cheesy and cliche at moments, and it sort of reminds me much of what people say about the Resident Evil series, at least the good ones. My overall impression of the novel is that Jordan looked at the Resident Evil series, liked it to a certain extent, at least story-wise, but wanted to write it in a much better way with more of a thriller Reacher-style twist. If that's what he was trying to do, most fans of the series of Resident Evil, like myself, would agree with my assessment of this. At least I would hope. Most of the characters are fleshed out in a very compelling way, no matter how little dialogue they might have. Even in cases where Jordan doesn't do that, his characterization is rather well done for the scenes that they are in. Why I can't say they come off as completely real people, because that is really hard to do in this sort of stories. It is a little bit too much like Resident Evil rewritten by Lee Child to accomplish that very well. with all that said and done, it's still very natural and works well with the pacing of the book. Talking about pacing, it is rather steady and rock solid. The book has calmer moments to establish the world, the character building elements rather well, and they're almost never just people explaining the plot of the story or characterization, basically exposition in a room or in a car or anything like that. As I said earlier, it's revealed in a rather natural and flowing manner with what's going on in the plot. These calmer scenes are broken up by several action scenes that can be a little hard to follow, but they still contain enough details so that along with the context of the calmer scenes that are established, you can still follow along with the action and at the same time keep the suspense alive. If I had any hint of criticism for Jordan, it seems that he follows this formula a little bit too strictly. This creates a problem with the pacing at the end of the book. While Jordan went with one of the more calmer, serene scenes for some excellent story development, even though it didn't really match the tone setting that was needed for the other scene to work before, it comes off as a little inconsistent. I do understand the choice of Jordan here, but this was like a knight going for a journey to find a magical sword to slay a normally unkillable dragon, who was happened to head into a kingdom the knight was sworn to protect. After finally discovering the sword, the knight turns to his companion to monologue or dialogue for a bit because of some personal or story reason that actually makes sense in context to the story. Yet, due to knowing the dragon could be at the kingdom any moment now, it seems a little odd he doesn't just grab the sword and rush out immediately to slay the beast. I understand the reverence being shown to the MacGuffin in the story here, but it does make sense in the story to treat this like it's a big moment, because it is. But in the story, it creates an inconsistency and problems with the pacing for the endgame. Now, I want to say it probably could have been handled in a much different way, with a few adjustments, but it wouldn't have paid quite the same respect that it deserved to the moment, the characters, or the supernatural element clearly set up from early on. And the twist that plays out shortly after that scene, there might be a few small hints to it on reread, probably plays into this odd bit of sort of a change in the dynamic of the story structure and tone. For some readers, this will most likely disorient most of them. But that might have been the author's attempt to convey a certain emotion of the scene, and the way Becker plays it off seems a little odd, but I'll give him that. The actual technical writing is fairly solid, detailed and expressive when it needs to be without going overboard to try to micromanage the audience's experiences or imagination. There are certain sections of the book where I could have used less, and there was other sections where I could have used more in these departments, but that is completely subjective, and by the end of the book, most of the stylistic choices made by Jordan seem to have served a good purpose. While I'm probably shooting myself in the foot by trying to keep this video fairly spoiler-free and because of the overview of the book since it's so new. In case any viewers want to have a deeper analysis of Dark Harvest, because frankly, I need to have actual cited examples to really go in deep and explain what I mean in all these sections, just let me know in the comments below. Frankly, I would have to spoil the hell out of this book to do a deep dive on it. Now let me get into the supernatural elements of the story. Mechanically, it seems to serve the purpose of how Becker and Dalton survive most of the Resident Evil style plot. And that seems to be why the Hail Mary play from earlier actually had a snowball's hell and chance of actually being pulled off and being believable in the story. Without it, some of the events of the story would have come off as even more contrived than they already did. It strongly suggests that good and evil, or a similar type of force, exist in this world as a real, tangible thing. But at the same time, it's still a mostly unseeable force. It is sprinkled in very lightly to sort of create a doubt within the reader, with really only one element making it a certainty. But the other place where you can feel its presence is where the zombie-ish virus comes from. The way it's set up in the book strikes me as sort of relating to Dante's Infernal's ice prison for Satan, by the way it sort of sets the tone and mood and sort of placement of that particular element of the story. But I could be reading too much into it. Sometimes the meaning you can take away from any given piece of medium can be planted by the author. Or, as I said before, it's something you find for yourself in the media itself. Death of the author is truly something that is interesting to talk about and really hard to figure out, but discussing it can be fun. Despite this, Dark Harvest seems to have a clear sense of who the good people are and who the bad people are, but it is not necessarily their intent or actions that determine that. Just like the gates of hell in Dante's Inferno, having the words above them, "Abandon all hope, ye who enters here. The road to hell is paved with good intentions." And the bad guys try to argue their intentions are good. Or maybe it's more like those in the story who lose all hope. Or maybe it's more like those in the story who lose all hope are the ones to lead us to hell. Both the good people and the bad people seem to have their good intents. Well, besides maybe one of them. But it doesn't seem like most of the characters have much hope from the start of the book. They start at low points and work their ways up. The difference between the two of them is how they deal with that hopelessness and how that is reflected in the story and how they react to those events. And given some real world events that have been going on for the last 2 years, I can't help but feel there's some connection to the story. But that just could be me projecting my personal bias into the content of a book, knowing what I do about the author. I can't even be sure that Jordan intended to have used the story with any such commentary about the current state of the world. Dark Harvest could just be meant to be a silly little fanfic of Resident Evil or evolution of it, or just got all that completely wrong and it's just meant to be a fun bit of fiction. But if I am right, I don't think Jordan believes the world handled the coronavirus very well. And the fact they put such faith in institutes such as the World Health Organization, even then, it's not a clear jab at the institution as a whole, but more about the leadership and the top-level decisions that are made by them. This can probably be expanded to more than just one example. The World Health Organization, that's the example I chose to reveal, but trust me, I don't think it was the only institution in the book that it could be commenting on, if it had any commentary at all in its pages, which I don't know about. Overall, this book could have been trying to say that we as individuals have to take responsibility for our own actions, not blindly follow everything that any, especially powerful institutes tell us, and most importantly, have some faith in goodness, if not in the supernatural kind, then at least in ourselves. And to not lose hope, no matter how hopeless things might seem in the moment, or over a long period of time. Things can change in just a moment sometimes. Sometimes having faith will get you through those tough times. Despite the criticisms, I would have to rate the book as rather good. Not top class, but a serious improvement over a lot of Hugo award-winning series that I've seen make it in science fiction. So that is saying a lot about current standards of writing, in my opinion. It's a rather straightforward story that uses some contrived plot elements to create some very strong scenes and moments. And with that, I'm done.